There's a moment in many relationships that almost no one talks about. Nothing explodes. There's no argument, no cold silence, no obvious change you can point to. On the surface, everything looks normal. She still talks to you. She still laughs. Daily routines continue. And yet something inside you tightens. It's not a thought. It's a feeling. A quiet discomfort you can't fully explain. Not because of what she's doing wrong, but because of what suddenly feels missing. The connection feels slightly thinner. The ease isn't the same. You feel more alert around her than relaxed. Most men dismiss this moment. They tell themselves they're overthinking. They assume peace means progress. But that subtle internal shift is rarely random. What you're experiencing isn't insecurity. It's intuition registering change before your conscious mind catches up. Human beings sense emotional shifts long before they can articulate them. Your nervous system notices when behavior and energy stop fully aligning. The problem is, men are often taught to ignore these signals, to wait for certainty, to demand proof, to stay calm and grateful as long as there's no conflict. But emotional distance doesn't always announce itself through drama. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as calm, and if you learn to understand that moment instead of dismissing it, it can change how you experience relationships entirely. One of the biggest misunderstandings men have about fear in relationships is assuming it must look dramatic. We expect guilt to look like panic. We expect dishonesty to look like nervousness or emotional breakdowns. But psychologically, fear rarely shows up that way. More often, fear looks like control. Not control in a manipulative or malicious sense, but emotional control, narrative control, self-control. When a woman feels there's something that could change how you see her or destabilize the relationship, her psychology doesn't move toward chaos. It moves toward protection. The human mind is wired to preserve safety when it senses threat, and emotional exposure can feel like a threat even when no harm is intended. This is why so many men miss the early signs. Fear doesn't always make people loud. Sometimes it makes them careful, measured, polished. It narrows expression rather than exploding it. The shift isn't from love to hostility, but from connection to management. Understanding this matters because if you're only watching for obvious red flags, you'll overlook the quieter changes that actually reveal the most. Fear doesn't announce itself. It tightens behavior. And once you recognize that, you stop confusing calm with emotional safety. One of the earliest signs of emotional guarding is a subtle tightening of access. She doesn't disappear. She doesn't pull away in an obvious way. In fact, she may seem just as present as before. She still checks in. She still engages. But something about the depth changes. Conversations become safer, less spontaneous, less vulnerable. There's nothing cold about it, just something more managed. You're included, but only in spaces that feel already organized and controlled. It's as if the emotional rooms you're invited into have been quietly cleaned and arranged ahead of time. Many men misread this shift as emotional maturity. They tell themselves, this is what stability looks like. At least we're not fighting. At least things feel calm. But emotional closeness isn't defined by the absence of conflict. It's defined by the presence of openness. When someone feels emotionally safe, they don't need to filter themselves so carefully. They can be unsure. They can contradict themselves. They can think out loud. Emotional tightening doesn't remove connection entirely. It simply narrows it. And if you're paying attention, you'll feel that narrowing long before you can explain it. Another subtle shift often appears in how predictable everything becomes. Her stories line up perfectly. Her explanations are smooth. There are fewer contradictions, fewer moments of uncertainty. On the surface, this can feel reassuring. Consistency is usually a sign of stability, but there's an important difference between natural consistency and rehearsed calm. When someone feels afraid of being misunderstood or discovered, they monitor themselves more closely. Fear sharpens attention. Responses come faster, not slower, as if the answer was already waiting. This isn't confidence, it's anticipation. Anticipation often comes from knowing which questions could lead somewhere uncomfortable. Authentic connection includes small inconsistencies. People remember things imperfectly. They correct themselves. They pause. They think out loud. Rehearsed calm removes those human edges. Everything feels polished, but also slightly flat. This doesn't mean someone is lying, it means they're managing themselves, and management requires effort. Over time, that effort becomes noticeable, not through mistakes, but through the absence of spontaneity. When predictability replaces presence, it's worth paying attention to what's being protected. Another quiet shift shows up in how responsibility is framed during conversations. Instead of talking about what happened, the focus slowly moves toward how things feel. Specifics fade, and emotional states take center stage. You may notice more language about being overwhelmed, stressed, or emotionally drained, especially when a conversation starts to approach something concrete. This isn't necessarily manipulation. In many cases, it's psychological displacement. When fear is present, the mind naturally gravitates towards safer ground. Feelings are harder to challenge than facts. If someone says, "I feel overwhelmed," there's nothing to argue with. Emotions don't require timelines, details, or explanations. Emotional truth can be genuine and still function as a shield. By shifting attention away from actions and toward internal states, the conversation softens. Tension reduces. Clarity, however, doesn't increase. Men often struggle here because they value directness. They want to understand what happened, not just how it felt. But when fear enters the picture, the mind protects itself by staying where things are less defined. Not to deceive, but to stay emotionally safe. One of the most confusing changes men experience is when conflict suddenly fades. Topics that once sparked discussion now dissolve quickly. Disagreements are smoothed over with phrases like, "It's not a big deal," or "I don't want to argue." On the surface, this can feel like progress. Things seem calmer, lighter, easier. But psychologically, this kind of peace often comes from avoidance, not resolution. When someone is protecting a hidden truth or an unresolved internal conflict, disagreement becomes risky. Arguments introduce unpredictability. They create emotional intensity, follow-up questions, and moments where control can slip. So the nervous system does something very specific. It minimizes friction. Calm becomes a strategy. You may notice she stops challenging you in ways she used to. Playful pushback fades. Honest disagreement softens, not because she suddenly agrees with everything, but because disagreement opens doors to deeper conversation, and deeper conversation invites exposure. This is why many men say, "She became nicer right before something felt off." That niceness isn't fake kindness. It's emotional caution. It's someone choosing stability over authenticity, even if they don't realize they're doing it. When a woman feels emotionally safe and open, curiosity flows naturally. She wants to understand how you think, how you interpret situations, what moves you emotionally. Questions aren't just functional, they're exploratory. They invite depth, reflection, and mutual discovery. When fear enters the picture, that curiosity often fades. She may still ask about your day, your work, or whether you've eaten, but the questions stay on the surface, useful, polite, efficient, but no longer revealing. This shift is subtle, which is why many men miss it. Curiosity creates reciprocity. When someone opens doors into your inner world, you naturally open doors into theirs. And when there's something a person doesn't want illuminated, fewer open doors feel safer. It's not disinterest, it's self-protection. The loss of curiosity doesn't mean connection is gone. It means depth has become risky. And emotional depth is always the first thing fear quietly restricts. Another pattern that often emerges is a quiet shift in how time and space are managed. Plans become more precise. Schedules feel tighter. Time with you fits neatly into defined windows rather than flowing naturally. At first, this looks like responsibility or busyness, but psychologically, it's something else. When someone fears discovery, they unconsciously reduce overlap between different parts of their life. Fewer blurred edges mean fewer chances for something unintended to surface. This isn't secrecy in the obvious sense, it's containment. Flexibility requires emotional safety. When someone feels open, time expands, plans adjust, moments linger. But fear prefers structure. It keeps interactions predictable and manageable. You may notice she arrives and leaves more deliberately. Conversations end cleanly. There's less lingering, less drifting into unplanned emotional space. None of this is dramatic. That's why it's effective. Containment doesn't create distance immediately. It creates order. And over time, that order can quietly replace intimacy if it goes unnoticed. As emotional guarding deepens, another subtle behavior often appears. Responsibility is acknowledged, but not explored. If you gently express that something feels off, she may agree quickly. You're right, I've been a little distant lately. The words validate your feeling, but the conversation doesn't move forward. There's no curiosity about impact, no exploration of what changed or why. The tension is named just enough to quiet it. Psychologically, this is a way of reducing discomfort while maintaining control. By agreeing without depth, emotional pressure decreases, but clarity doesn't increase. This can be confusing for men because agreement usually signals resolution, but here it functions more like a pause button. The issue is recognized, not opened. Emotional reasoning often replaces explanation. I just needed space. It didn't feel like the right time. Feelings are real. But when they become the end point of conversation rather than the beginning, they can quietly prevent alignment. And over time, repeated surface-level agreement without engagement becomes a pattern worth noticing. Another behavior that often surfaces is selective transparency. She may still share openly about certain areas of her life, while becoming noticeably vague about others. You're not met with refusal or defensiveness. Instead, the details simply thin out. Stories that once had texture become summaries. Events are described without names, timelines, or context. Conversations move quickly past certain moments, not because there's nothing to say, but because saying more would feel unsafe. This isn't lying in the traditional sense. It's omission guided by anxiety. When the mind senses threat, it doesn't always invent new realities. More often, it trims existing ones. Less information means less exposure. And because nothing overtly deceptive is happening, men often tell themselves they're imagining the change. What matters here isn't a single missing detail, it's consistency. When certain topics repeatedly lose depth while others remain vivid, the pattern speaks. Transparency isn't about how much someone shares overall, it's about where openness quietly stops. One of the most overlooked signals isn't something she says or does. It's something you feel when you're around her. The room feels slightly different when you enter. Conversations subtly recalibrate. The energy adjusts, not enough to raise alarms, but enough to register. When someone feels emotionally safe, their nervous system relaxes in your presence. Reactions are immediate, laughter is unfiltered, emotions move freely. But when fear is present, self-monitoring increases. You may notice her responses arrive a second later. Her tone feels more even. Her reactions seem edited rather than instinctive. This isn't acting, it's alertness. The body stays ready when there's something it's trying to protect. Emotional spontaneity decreases because unpredictability feels risky. Men often dismiss this sensation because it's hard to explain logically, but coherence matters. When words, tone, and energy fully align, you feel settled. When they don't, your nervous system notices first. That awareness isn't weakness, it's attunement, and it deserves attention.